My name is Natalie Pierce. I am 28 years old, and this is my true story. This really happened to me, and it completely changed my life. I once trusted someone deeply, but what they did to me was so shocking, so terrifying that I'm still haunted by it. Today, I want you to know how betrayal can come from the people you love the most. What started as something small soon turned into a nightmare I never imagined. If you really want to know how it all happened, then stay with me till the very end, because my story will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and remember, this story is written and edited by Dark Life Side Diaries. My nightmare began 4 years ago when I was introduced to Ethan through a mutual friend at a wedding. He was charming, confident, with a smile that made me feel like I was the only person in the room, and after years of failed relationships, I thought I had finally met the man who would protect me, love me, and build a life with me. In the beginning, everything was perfect, almost too perfect. He spoiled me with surprise trips, late night drives with music blasting, whispered promises that he would never let me go, and for a while, I believed him. I believed every word he said. Because when you're desperate to be loved, you don't notice the cracks that slowly begin to form beneath the surface. It wasn't long after we got married that things began to change. The thoughtful man who once held my hand every night suddenly became possessive, controlling, and cold, questioning me about who I texted, why I took too long at the grocery store, or why I wore certain clothes when we went out. And each time I tried to reason with him, he would smile that same charming smile and tell me I was imagining things, that he only wanted to protect me. At first, I dismissed the red flags, telling myself it was just jealousy, that maybe he loved me too much. But little by little, his obsession consumed every part of my life, and I began to feel like a prisoner inside my own home. He didn't let me work, cut me off from some of my closest friends, and even convinced me to delete social media because too many men looked at me, and I agreed, thinking that sacrifice was part of marriage, thinking that maybe if I obeyed him, things would go back to how they once were. But instead, the walls of my world grew tighter and tighter around me. The worst part was how skillfully he could switch between two faces in public. Ethan was the perfect husband, polite, generous, attentive, while behind closed doors he was someone else entirely, someone dark with eyes that burned with a kind of anger I couldn't explain. I remember one night in particular when I came home 5 minutes later than expected after running to the pharmacy. He grabbed my wrist so tightly I thought it would snap, leaned in so close I could feel his breath on my cheek, and whispered that if I ever lied to him again, he would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. I told myself he didn't mean it, that it was just words said in anger, but something about the way his face twisted that night made me feel like I wasn't looking at the man I married anymore. I was looking at something else, something dangerous. Months passed like that, each day walking on eggshells, each night pretending everything was fine, until I began noticing little things around the house that made my blood run cold. Doors I swore I locked standing open in the morning, strange noises coming from the basement when Ethan was away, and once late at night I found his phone unlocked on the couch. And when I scrolled through it, I discovered dozens of pictures of me sleeping, showering, cooking, even sitting in the bathroom. Pictures I never knew. He took. My stomach churned as I realized he'd been watching me, constantly documenting my every move like I was some kind of possession instead of a wife. I confronted him about it the next morning, shaking, holding his phone in my hands as proof, and for the first time he didn't smile. He didn't even deny it. He just stared at me with those cold, empty eyes and said, "You're mine, Natalie. Every breath you take belongs to me." That was the moment I knew I was trapped with a monster, and I needed to find a way out before it was too late. But leaving Ethan was easier said than done. Every attempt I made to gather money to talk to a lawyer, or even to stay a night at my friend's place, ended with him showing up as if he always knew what I was planning. And sometimes he would whisper things that made me wonder if he was following me, listening to me, even reading my messages. My paranoia grew, and yet no matter how careful I was, he always seemed one step ahead, until one night when I was alone in the house, I decided to check the basement, the one place I rarely went, because Ethan insisted it was his space. As I crept down the wooden steps, the air grew colder, and in the dim light I noticed something tucked behind the water heater, a locked trunk. My hand shook as I pried it open with a screwdriver I found on the shelf, and inside I discovered something that made my entire body go numb. Stacks of journals filled with Ethan's handwriting, each page documenting every detail of my life, every word I ever said, every movement I ever made, with dates and times written like some twisted catalog of my existence. But that wasn't all. There were also photographs of other women I didn't know their faces circled in red ink notes. Scribbled about their routines, their weaknesses, their addresses. My breath caught in my throat as I realized Ethan had done this before that. Maybe I wasn't the first woman he trapped. Maybe I wouldn't be the last, and just as I clutched one of the journals, the sound of the basement door creaking open above me made my blood freeze in my veins. The sound of the basement door opening above me sent a shiver so sharp through my spine that I couldn't even breathe. I froze in place, clutching one of Ethan's journals against my chest as if it might shield me from what was about to come, and my mind raced with the horrifying thought that he had been watching me again. That he somehow knew I was down here, touching the one place he never wanted me to touch. His footsteps creaked on the stairs, slowly, deliberately, the way a predator circles prey before striking, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But my body refused to move. Then, just as his shadow stretched across the floor, I shoved the journal back into the trunk, slammed the lid shut, and hid behind the water heater, pressing my hand over my mouth to silence the sound of my shaking breath. Ethan's figure appeared in the dim light. His face calm, but his eyes searching, and for one terrifying second, I thought he would find me right there. But then he crouched beside the trunk, ran his hand over the lock, and whispered to himself, "Good. Girl's still where I left it." My heart pounded as I realized he didn't know. I had opened it, and after a few tense moments, he turned, walked up the stairs, and closed the basement door, leaving me trembling in the darkness. That night I barely slept. Lying awake beside him, every breath reminding me of the monster I shared a bed with, and I knew deep inside that if I didn't act soon, I wouldn't make it out alive. Over the next week, I secretly copied pages from his journals when he was at work, stuffing them into a folder I hid inside the lining of my purse. Evidence I planned to take to the police, though even that plan felt fragile, because what if he already suspected? What if he had cameras hidden I still hadn't found? Every time he touched me, every time he kissed me on the cheek, I felt sick, as though I was living with a stranger whose true self was something inhuman, something obsessed not with love, but with ownership. The turning point came when I received a call from my best friend Emily, who I hadn't seen in months because Ethan convinced me she was bad for our marriage. Emily's voice was frantic, her words tumbling over each other as she told me she had been receiving strange calls at night. Silent calls that never spoke but breathed heavily into the phone, and her gut told her it was Ethan. My heart sank as I realized his obsession wasn't limited to me anymore. It was spreading outward, reaching into the lives of people I loved, and the thought of Emily being hurt because of me filled me with guilt so strong I nearly confessed everything right there. Instead, I asked her to meet me the next day at a cafe, a place far enough from our house that Ethan would have no reason to follow. But when I arrived, Emily's eyes widened at the sight of me, and she whispered urgently, "Natalie, I think he's following me right now." My blood went cold as I looked out the window and saw a familiar black car parked across the street. One I had seen Ethan drive many times, and though the windows were tinted, I knew he was inside watching. I told Emily to stay calm, to act normal, and we spent the next 20 minutes sipping coffee while my hands shook so badly I nearly spilled the cup, and all the while I could feel his gaze burning through the glass. That night when I returned home, Ethan was sitting in the darkened living room, his silhouette outlined by the glow of a single lamp, and the moment I walked in he asked softly, "Did you have fun today?" His voice was so calm it terrified me more than if he had screamed, and when I stammered something about running errands, he only smiled, tapped his fingers against the armrest, and said, "Remember, Natalie, I always know where you are." It was then I realized he wasn't just watching me, he was toying with me, testing how far he could push before I broke. Desperation took root in me after that, and I began planning my escape more seriously, memorizing Ethan's work schedule, mapping the quickest routes to the police station, and keeping a small bag hidden under the bed with closed cash and the copied journal pages. Days turned into weeks, and though I played the obedient wife on the surface, inside I was unraveling, my heart beating constantly in panic, my mind rehearsing scenarios of what would happen if I failed. Then one night, as I was pretending to sleep, I felt Ethan get out of bed, heard his slow footsteps down the hall, and curiosity made me quietly follow him, padding barefoot until I saw him slip into the basement again. My breath caught as I peeked down the stairs and saw him kneeling before the trunk, not just writing this time, but speaking aloud, muttering names I didn't recognize, words like "next one" and "she never leave." Horror surged through me as I realized he wasn't planning to stop. He was already thinking of other women, maybe even Emily, and if I didn't stop him, the cycle would continue. That night, I made my decision. I wouldn't just escape Ethan, I would destroy him. Over the next few days, I secretly recorded his mutterings from the basement on my phone, adding to the folder of evidence I kept hidden, and I reached out to Emily one last time, telling her in code that I was preparing to leave, but I needed her help to cover for me. Every second felt like walking on a knife's edge because Ethan's moods grew darker, his temper shorter, as though he sensed something slipping out of his control. On the night I finally gathered the courage to leave, I waited until he was in the shower, grabbed my purse with the evidence, and ran for the door, but just as I turned the knob, a hand clamped down on my wrist, and I spun around to see him standing there, dripping wet, eyes burning with fury. "Going somewhere?" he hissed, and before I could answer, he shoved me against the wall so hard my vision blurred, his grip tightening as he demanded, "What do you think you're doing?" My heart pounded as I stammered something about fresh air, but his eyes darted to the purse, and before I could stop him, he ripped it open and spilled the contents onto the floor. The journals, the recordings, the cash, all of it scattered between us, and the look on his face twisted into something so unrecognizable, so monstrous that I thought he might kill me right there. He leaned close, his voice low and trembling with rage, and said, "You shouldn't have done this, Natalie. Now you'll never leave." And as his hand wrapped around my throat, I realized this was the moment everything would change. His hand tightened around my throat, cutting off my air, and as I clawed at his arm with trembling fingers, stars exploded in my vision, the world narrowing down to the terrifying thought that this was how I would die in my own home at the hands of the man I once promised forever to. But then, almost as quickly as he had grabbed me, Ethan released his grip, letting me crumple to the floor, gasping for breath, and he crouched in front of me with that unnerving calm smile he wore when he wanted to scare me without raising his voice. "You think you're clever," he whispered, picking up one of the journal pages. I had copied, waving it in front of my tear-filled eyes like a trophy. "But you don't know what I've been preparing. You don't know what I've built for you." His words chilled me more than the bruises on my neck, and when he dragged me down the basement stairs, I realized the nightmare wasn't just beginning. It had already been set in motion long ago. The basement, which I had always thought of as just dark and cold, looked different under the flickering bulb that night. Chains hung from the walls, a small cot was shoved in the corner, and the trunk was wide open, filled with notebooks upon notebooks I hadn't even touched. Ethan shoved me into the corner and stood over me like a warden, his eyes gleaming as he said, "I knew you'd betray me one day. Natalie, that's why I made this place this way. I'll always know where you are." The realization hit me like a blade. He had planned not just to watch me, but to keep me, to lock me away, like one of his twisted possessions, and for the first time I screamed a sound so raw and primal it startled even me. Ethan's expression hardened, and he raised his hand as if to strike, but then stopped, shaking his head, slowly muttering, "Not yet, no, not yet." Instead, he bound my wrists with rope and left me there in the basement, the sound of the lock clicking above my head, sealing me into a tomb I wasn't sure I'd ever escape. Hours bled into what felt like days, the only measure of time being the faint glow of daylight that leaked through a tiny window near the ceiling, and though fear gnawed at me, I forced myself to think, to stay alive, because if I surrendered to despair, Ethan would win completely. Every time he descended the stairs, he brought food or water, always watching as I ate, always murmuring strange words about destiny and devotion, and though I pretended to be broken inside, I was memorizing everything: where he kept the keys, how long he lingered, what tools were within reach. At night, when the house was silent, I whispered to myself over and over, "Survive, wait, escape." But the longer I stayed, the clearer it became that Ethan wasn't going to kill me quickly. He wanted me to live, to suffer in the prison of his obsession, and the thought of years wasted in that basement drove me to the edge of madness. One evening, when he came down carrying a tray, I asked him softly, "Why are you doing this?" He stared at me, eyes blazing with a mix of love and hate, and whispered, "Because I can't lose you. If you leave, I'll disappear. If you stay, I'll always be real." His words chilled me because they didn't sound like a man in love. They sounded like a man unraveling his identity, tethered to me in ways I couldn't comprehend. That night, as I lay on the cot, I realized there was only one way out. I had to become what he wanted to see, to convince him I was no longer a threat, and then strike when he least expected it. So the next morning, when he unlocked the door, I smiled faintly and whispered, "You were right. I shouldn't have tried to leave." His eyes softened, and for the first time he unbound my wrists while I ate, sitting across from me like we were on a date instead of in a dungeon, and I knew my plan was working. Over the next week, I played the role perfectly: obedient, soft-spoken, grateful, and slowly Ethan began to trust me again, even taking me upstairs for short moments, though always under his watchful eye. But those brief glimpses of freedom were enough for me to see what had changed. The curtains drawn, the locks were placed. And on the table by the door, a small keyring he carried everywhere one night when he fell asleep on the couch after drinking. I carefully slipped the keys from his pocket, my hands trembling as though the metal burned my skin, and I crept toward the front door, every step louder in my ears than thunder. But just as I slid the key into the lock, a floorboard creaked and his voice slithered through the darkness. "Natalie." I froze, turning slowly to see him standing in the shadows, his face unreadable for a heartbeat. Neither of us moved. Then he lunged, and I bolted, fumbling with the door until it flew open, and I sprinted into the night barefoot, the cold pavement tearing at my feet. I could hear him behind me shouting my name, his footsteps pounding closer, and when I stumbled onto the front lawn, headlights suddenly blinded me. A car screeched to a halt, and Emily's voice screamed my name. She had come. I flung myself into the passenger seat, yelling at her to drive, and she slammed the gas as Ethan's figure grew smaller in the rearview mirror, his face twisted in rage. Relief washed over me in waves, but it was short-lived because I knew Ethan wouldn't stop. He would come for me, for Emily, for anyone who stood in his way. As we sped through the night, Emily grabbed my shaking hands and whispered, "It's okay, you're safe now." But deep inside, I knew the nightmare was far from over. Ethan's journals were still out there, his obsessions still burning. And if I wanted this to end, I couldn't just run. I had to end him before he ended me. The night Emily saved me should have been the end, but in my heart I knew Ethan wasn't the type of man to accept defeat. He was the type who lived in breath control, who would rather burn the whole world down than see me escape his grasp. For the first few days I stayed with Emily, jumping at every sound outside the window, sleeping with the lights on, and clutching the phone like a lifeline. But no calls came, no sightings were reported, and for a moment I almost believed he had vanished into the shadows. But then the letters started slipped under the door at night, each one written in his slanted handwriting filled with words that twisted my stomach into knots. "You belong to me. You can't run from forever. I'm closer than you think." Emily begged me to go to the police again, but when they came, all they found were the letters. And though they promised to patrol the area, their voices carried the same doubt I had seen before, as if Ethan were nothing more than a figment of my hysteria. I knew better. One night I woke to find the window open in the guest room, the curtains swaying though I swore I had locked it, and on the windowsill was a single black feather, one of the symbols Ethan had drawn again and again in his journals. That was when I realized this wasn't just about survival anymore. I couldn't live my life as prey, jumping at shadows, waiting for the day he finally dragged me back into his nightmare. I had to end it once and for all, so I returned to the house where it had all begun, this time with Emily by my side. Though she trembled when she saw the boarded-up windows and the dead garden that seemed to whisper of decay. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered, clutching my arm, but I nodded because deep down I knew Ethan would return here. It was his shrine, his lair, the place where he believed he had built a future for us. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust, but the journals were still there, stacked neatly in the trunk like trophies, and as I flipped through page after page, I realized something chilling. Ethan hadn't just written about me, he had written about Emily, about anyone I had turned to for help, and in his twisted narrative, every person who loved me was an obstacle he would eliminate. My blood ran cold, and before I could even warn Emily, the sound of footsteps creaked above us, slow and deliberate. He was here. I motioned for her to hide behind the trunk as I grabbed one of the heavy iron candlesticks from the shelf. My heart pounding so loud I thought it would give us away. The basement door creaked open, and Ethan's silhouette appeared, taller, more menacing than I remembered, his voice drifting down the stairs in that same soft tone that used to make me feel safe but now only filled me with dread. "Natalie, I knew you'd come back. You always come back." Step by step, he descended, his eyes glinting in the dim light, and for the first time, I didn't shrink away. I stood taller, gripping the candlestick, my voice shaking but steady as I said, "This ends tonight." He laughed, a low, broken sound, and lunged toward me, his hands outstretched like claws, but before he could reach me, Emily leapt from the shadows, slamming the trunk lid against his arm. With a sickening crack, he roared in pain, staggering, and I swung the candlestick with every ounce of strength in me, the impact echoing through the basement as he fell to his knees. But he was strong, too strong, and as he tried to rise, I remembered the chains on the wall, the ones he had meant for me, and with Emily's help, we wrestled him against the stone, clamping the cold metal around his wrists before he could break free. He thrashed, screaming my name, spitting words like poison. "You'll regret this. You can't survive without me." But for the first time, I saw him not as a monster, but as a broken Man shackled by his own madness, the power he had held over me for so long was gone. Still, I knew the chains wouldn't hold forever. And I wasn't about to give him another chance. Emily called the police, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face, and within minutes sirens pierced the night. When they dragged Ethan out of that basement, his eyes locked on mine, full of hate and something else, fear. Maybe he finally realized he had lost. The trial that followed was grueling, his defense painting me as unstable as dramatic, but the evidence, the journals, the basement, the bruises, was undeniable. And when the jury declared him guilty, I felt a weight lift from my chest I hadn't known. I was carrying Ethan was sentenced to life, but even then I knew the scars he left would never truly fade. Some nights, I still wake to the phantom feeling of his hands around my throat, to the echo of his voice in my ears. But when I see the sunlight streaming through my window, when I hear Emily's laughter in the kitchen, I remind myself that I won, I survived, and though Ethan may haunt my nightmares, he will never control my life again. To anyone listening to my story, know this: sometimes the monsters we fear aren't strangers lurking in the dark. They're the ones we once trusted most, and the only way to defeat them is to take back your power, even if it means walking through hell to do it. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If you found it gripping, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps me bring more real horror tales like this to you.